Picture the interior of this continent from above. Red, flat, endless in a way that stops making sense after a while. Your brain just can't hold the scale of it. The Australian Outback is larger than Western Europe, larger than India, and it holds, scattered across its surface like broken teeth, a population density roughly equivalent to Mars. There's nothing out there, except, and this is the part that gets you, there is. Pull up satellite imagery of certain coordinates in South Australia, in Western Australia, in the Northern Territory, and you'll start seeing things that shouldn't be there. Rectangular structures, street grids, what looks like a main road running through something that was at some point a town center. No markers on the map, no Wikipedia entry, no road leading in, just shapes. We know about the obvious ghost towns, the ones you can drive to, the ones with heritage signs and weekend tourists taking photos. But this video isn't about those. This is about the places further out, the ones that died so completely that the country forgot to mourn them. Places preserved not by care, but by absolute isolation. Baked into the earth by 50-degree summers, sealed shut by the silence of decades. What does it mean for a place to exist when no one is there to witness it? That's not a philosophical question. It's a practical one. And the answer, once you start digging, is stranger than you'd expect. These are the ghost towns of the Australian Outback, ranked from the melancholy to the unreachable. 5 places, 5 different kinds of disappearance. Let's go. Number 5, Silverton, New South Wales. The town that almost made it. Start here because Silverton is the one ghost town in this list that you can actually visit. It's still on the map. There's even a pub, the Silverton Hotel, which has been running in some form since 1884 and apparently has no intention of stopping. But don't let that fool you. Silverton, at its peak, in the mid-1880s, had 3,000 people. 3,000. Out there in the far west of New South Wales, where the Gibber Plains begin and the heat sits on everything like a weight. There were churches, a newspaper, a courthouse, a school, 2 hotels, and enough commerce to make someone genuinely believe this was a place with a future. Silver did that. A silver rush in 1883 pulled people in from everywhere, from the eastern cities, from overseas, from the goldfields further west. Silverton felt, briefly, like somewhere. Then Broken Hill happened. Broken Hill is about 25 kilometers east, and when the mining operations there grew into something genuinely enormous, one of the richest silver-lead-zinc deposits ever discovered, Silverton's ore, by comparison, stopped making economic sense. Companies pulled out. Workers followed the money. The railway that had come to Silverton in 1884 redirected its traffic elsewhere by the end of the decade. Within 3 years of its peak, Silverton had lost most of its population. Not all at once. That's the thing people don't realize. It wasn't a single event. It was a slow bleed. A shop closes. A family leaves. Another shop closes. The newspaper stops printing because there's no one left to read it. The courthouse empties because there's no one left to prosecute. A 3,000-person town became a handful of residents by 1900. What's left now is strange in a specific way. The pub, some heritage buildings, a film set because the landscape around Silverton has been used in dozens of Australian films. The muted reds and ochres photographed beautifully. Mad Max was shot here, Priscilla, various others. The place has become famous in a way, but famous as a backdrop, a set, not as somewhere people actually live. There's something quietly uncomfortable about that. A town that survived only by becoming decorative, but Silverton, at least, survived in some form. The places coming up on this list weren't that lucky. Number 4, Farina, South Australia. The town, the rain never came. For Farina is about 600 kilometers north of Adelaide, sitting in a landscape that gets around 150 millimeters of rain a year. On a good year, sometimes less. When settlers arrived in the 1870s, they'd been told by the colonial government, based on genuinely optimistic and genuinely wrong agricultural science of the time, that the land could support wheat farming. Rain follows the plow, the theory went. The idea was that once you broke the soil and farmed it, the rainfall patterns would change.
The progress here
the land
is
would
excellent.
respond. It didn't.
Now let's shift
but
our
for a
attention
while,
to the area
people
just
didn't know
beyond
that
the
yet.
main street.
Farina, originally called government gums, grew through the 1880s into a functioning town of several hundred people. There was a bakery, a butcher, a hotel, a police station, a railway halt on the Ghan line. The Afghan cameleers who worked the trade routes through Central Australia used Farina as a stopover. For a moment, the place had genuine purpose. The rain never reliably came. The wheat crops failed more often than they succeeded. Slowly, that word again, slowly, the farmers accepted what the land had been trying to tell them the whole time. They weren't supposed to be there. The Ghan railway line closed its Farina halt in 1980. That was more or less it. What remains now is genuinely affecting to look at. A volunteer group has been partially restoring the ruins since 2014, not to habitation, just to preservation. Stone walls standing against nothing. The underground bakery, which stayed remarkably cool in the summer heat, still has its original oven. You can stand in it. You can see exactly where someone worked, where the bread sat, where the heat came from. There's a specific quality to ruins in arid environments. They don't rot. They don't collapse the way structures do in wet climates. They just bleach. The wood turns pale and hard. The stone stays exactly where it was placed. Farina looks like it's been paused rather than destroyed. But that sense of pause, that's what this whole video is building toward. Because Farina, at least, has people tending to it. The places ahead on this list have no one. Number 3, the railway towns. When a line on a map became a death sentence. This one is harder to pin to a single place because it happened to dozens of towns simultaneously. And that's exactly what makes it so strange. In the early 20th century, South Australia and Western Australia had hundreds of small settlements built around railway infrastructure. These weren't mining towns or agricultural experiments. They existed specifically because the train stopped there. A water stop, a service depot, a place where goods were loaded and unloaded.
Watch it! Have cargo
The train
coming
was
through.
the reason for the town's
Make sure that's
existence.
secured before we pull
Full
out.
stop. And then, sometimes overnight, sometimes over a few months, the route changed. A bureaucratic decision, somewhere in an office in Adelaide or Perth. A new survey, a more efficient alignment. The kind of decision that gets made without anyone in the affected town having any say in it. Because towns this size didn't really have advocates. They were too small to have political weight. Burra Creek, Quorn, Udnadatta. The old Ghan towns strung across South Australia like beads on a thread. Most of them went into decline the moment the railway redrew itself around them. What's particularly striking about the railway ghost towns, compared to the mining
town's
ones,
layout is
the
chaotic,
completeness
following
of the
veins
death.
of ore. The railway town,
Mining
however,
towns
is a
at least
stark
had a
grid,
reason for
frozen in
existing that the
time.
residents could point to. The ore ran out. What can you do? But the railway towns died because of a decision made by people who never visited them. That's a different kind of wound. There are settlements along the old Ghan route, north of Maree, through the Jibba Desert, where the station buildings still stand. Corrugated iron, timber platforms. In some cases, the rails themselves are still there, just disconnected, going nowhere. You can find photographs taken by travelers in the 1970s of some of these stations. They look exactly the same now as they did then. Same platforms, same weather vane. The desert doesn't renovate. What I keep coming back to is this. In some of those images, there are signs still mounted on the buildings. Departure times, station names, instructions for passengers who stopped coming 50 years ago. Number 2, Maralinga, the towns the government took. This is where the tone shifts. Because up until now, We've been talking about places that were abandoned, through economic failure, through bad luck, through decisions that nobody fully intended to be fatal. But Maralinga is different. Maralinga is in the far west of South Australia, deep in the Woomera prohibited area, a military zone that covers roughly 122,000 square kilometers of the country's interior. That's larger than England. And for most of the 1950s, Britain used it as a nuclear testing site. Between 1956 and 1963, 12 nuclear devices were detonated at Maralinga. Some were full-scale weapons tests. Others were smaller experiments. But the smaller experiments, called the Vixen B trials, actually involved detonating conventional explosives packed with plutonium, which scattered radioactive contamination across the site in ways that proved far more difficult to clean up than a single large detonation.
The spirits of our ancestors
the Maralinga Tjarutja people, the Aboriginal communities whose country this was, were not adequately warned, not adequately evacuated, and not adequately protected. That part of the story is not incidental. It's central to what Maralinga is. But here's what this video is specifically about: the infrastructure that was built there. To support the testing program, the British and Australian governments constructed a functioning town, Maralinga Village, sealed roads, a mess hall that could seat hundreds, a church, a cinema, accommodation for up to 1,000 personnel, a hospital, sports facilities. By 1967, the tests were over and the British had left. The Australian government did a partial cleanup in the late 1960s, which, as later investigations revealed, was deeply inadequate. And then the site was simply closed, fenced, restricted. The village didn't come down. It was just locked inside the fence. Aerial photographs from the 1980s show the buildings still standing, roads still visible. The layout of a functioning settlement, intact, inside a prohibited zone that most Australians have never visited and never will. There was a more serious decontamination effort in the late 1990s, over $100 million, one of the largest such operations in Australian history. And parts of the land were formally handed back to the Maralinga Tjarutja people in 2009. But the cleanup was targeted at the test sites themselves, the contaminated soil, the scattered debris. Not all of the village infrastructure. Some of what was built there in the 1950s is still standing, in a restricted zone, behind fences that haven't been opened. Think about that for a moment. A town with roads and buildings and a cinema that has existed inside a locked perimeter for more than 50 years, with essentially no human presence. Not abandoned through failure. Deliberately sealed. That's a different category of absence. Number 1. The unnamed settlement. Coordinates, no name, no explanation. This is the one that I genuinely couldn't fully explain. And I want to be upfront about that. In satellite imagery, available through standard commercial platforms, nothing classified, there are features in the far interior of Western Australia that are consistent with a built settlement. Rectangular structures. What appears to be a cleared central area, possibly a road junction or a yard. Smaller outbuildings arranged in a rough pattern, consistent with habitation rather than industrial use. No name on any mapping platform. No listing in the historical record of the Western Australian government's surveying archives that clearly corresponds to this location. No Wikipedia entry. No heritage listing. No road leading to it on any current or historical road map I could find. The coordinates place it in a region that was, in the late 19th and early 20th century, explored by prospectors moving through on extended expeditions. There are journal entries from the 1890s describing camps in this general area, but general is doing a lot of work in that sentence. This part of the country covers an area the size of a small European country, and historical navigation was imprecise. What we can say from the satellite imagery is that whatever those structures are, they appear to predate the satellite era. The surrounding landscape shows no evidence of vehicle tracks approaching from any direction. The vegetation pattern around the site is consistent with decades of undisturbed growth. The last plausible date of human activity at this location, based on the available visual evidence, is somewhere before 1970. Possibly earlier. Who built it? For what purpose? When did they leave? And why? I don't have answers to any of those questions. And I want to sit with that for a second because we're not used to that in this era. The idea that there is something on the surface of the earth, something built by human hands, that we simply cannot account for. We're used to the idea that everything is documented, everything is findable, but the interior of this continent is large enough to hide things, has always been large enough to hide things. And whatever is at those coordinates has been sitting there, unchanged, unseen, for longer than most of us have been alive. No one has entered it. No researcher has physically reached it. No camera has stood inside whatever those structures once contained. It just exists. In isolation so complete that it almost seems deliberate. Here's what strikes me after going through all of this. We tend to think of abandoned places as sad. And some of them are. Farina, with its bleached stone walls, and its bakery oven that still smells faintly of ash. The railway towns with their departure schedules for trains that stopped running before anyone watching this video was born. These places carry a particular weight. But the ones further out, the sealed zones, the unnamed coordinates, those don't feel sad exactly. They feel like something else, something harder to name, more like standing at the edge of a very deep body of water and looking down. The Outback didn't destroy these places. That's the thing. It preserved them. The same conditions that make the interior hostile to human life. The heat, the dryness, the absolute absence of moisture. Those conditions are extraordinary preservatives. Wood doesn't rot. Metal doesn't rust, or at least not quickly. Stone stands for centuries. So the things that were built out there, they're still there. Most of them. Exactly as they were left, which means somewhere in that red interior, there are rooms that haven't been entered in 50 years, tables that haven't been touched, objects sitting exactly where someone placed them and then walked away from, permanently as it turned out, though they probably didn't know that when they left. That's what the Outback does. It doesn't erase, it holds. And somewhere out there, at coordinates, I'm not going to read out, because honestly, what would that change? There's a settlement with no name, built by people whose identities we've lost, abandoned for reasons we don't understand, sitting in silence that has lasted longer than most countries have had governments. It's there right now, whatever it is.